This morning, crews are prepping in anticipation of rescuing the next group of the remaining members of the Boy Scouts.
We're a number of years on from the rescue that occurred in Thailand now, in Tam Luang in 2018. And with the movies and documentaries that have come out, it seems to have become accepted that diving people out of a cave is a routine and relatively straightforward thing to do. Diving a casualty out is an absolute last resort. It's far more preferable to find a dry way if that's at all possible, and even if that means waiting in the cave for water to recede for a number of days even. The diving option as a last resort should only be used if there's a high probability that the casualty is going to die.
There's no point in attempting to dive someone out unless you have all the appropriate equipment to hand and it's functioning properly. In the UK, all the cave rescue teams use the Kirby Morgan super mask. This is a very simple mask and is robust, but its principal advantage is that it has a separate pod to which the second stage is attached. The reason that we've chosen the super mask was because any second stage regulator can be added to that pod, so any regulator that most divers are familiar with. The super mask also lends itself to the whole kitting up process of a casualty in a cave. Everything can be accomplished with the pod removed and the casualty breathing the cave air, and it's only when everybody's ready to go that the pod can be attached and the diver starts breathing off his gas supply at the last minute. When we were planning the Thailand cave rescue, we chose to use the positive pressure masks for two principal reasons, namely keeping water outside the mask and also to help the unconscious boys to breathe. The disadvantage of that is if you dislodge it severely, there will be a massive outward leak of air and of course you're depleting your breathing gas.
In Tam Luang, we dive the casualties face down. That's really important for a number of reasons. Firstly, any water that enters the mask will pull away from the casualty's face, and so they'll be able to breathe for the maximum amount of time, and it's also possible to clear that mask underwater. It also is a much more natural way of moving. If you're conscious and you can see where you're going in a diving orientation, you're normally always facing down and looking forwards. If the casualty's sort of face down and helping you, we would normally use a side mount rig. We would strap 2 cylinders to the side of the casualty. We would use a switch block to switch between the gas in those 2 cylinders, and also we would have the ability to plumb in off-board gas from somewhere else. That gives us an almost unlimited supply of breathing gas for the casualty through the sump, but we would aim ideally to make sure the side mount cylinders are adequate for the entire journey and that the off-board gas is kept as a reserve, but we could change that out if we needed to. There's a significant preference for diving a casualty out when they're conscious. That may seem obvious. In Tam Luang, we sedated the children because we had no other option. I would much have preferred to bring a casualty out conscious if we thought they could be helpful to us. If they have their hands free, they can fend off the rocks, we can move slowly, they can even provide a signal that they're okay. You can get continuous feedback that there's no problem from the casualty. Again, it's an absolute last resort to dive a casualty out. It's an even greater risk and last resort to think of sedating them and bringing them out. If they're face down and conscious with their hands free, they can hopefully, if they're a diver, help you by clearing their mask. They can even look at pressure gauges. You've got an extra pair of hands, potentially a pair of eyes, to help on the journey out.
One thing we were concerned about in Thailand was maintaining the airway, and we had various ideas for this, but what we found during the trials in the swimming pool was the buoyancy of the full face mask tended to lift the head up and extend the airway, keeping it open.
Buoyancy of a casualty is a really important consideration, especially if you have to change depth significantly. The feet of a casualty tend to be quite heavy, so having a float on their feet, or if you're using a dry suit, trying to get some air in their feet, usually makes the whole process easier. You want to try and have the casualty moving horizontally in the water and bumping on the rocks as little as possible. And most importantly, as you come up, you need to move very slowly and make sure that you can deflate and keep control of their buoyancy. If you have to put the casualty down, you need to make sure that you don't lay them in the mud. Again, if they've got hands, they can keep their face off the mud or the floor of the cave. In Tamloan, we strapped the cylinder the boys were breathing from to their chest, and that acted as a keel, both to hold them in a face-down orientation to make sure they couldn't rotate, but also if they had to be left on the floor for any reason, then they would sit on the cylinder rather than actually sit on their face mask again and potentially dislodge it.
Unless the injury is of such severity that some form of splinting is required, such as a spinal board, we have found it is much simpler and more efficient not to use a stretcher. This creates a casualty that is more streamlined and easier to manoeuvre through the underwater passageways.
The most crucial time of diving someone out is the transition from the dry cave into moving in the water, and also the transition from moving in the water back to safety in the airspace beyond. It's very easy at either of those points to inadvertently drown the casualty, especially when you turn them over. If there's any water in the mask, you're going to find that the water that had pooled in the bottom of the mask and was safely away from the casualty's face is immediately dumped into their face when you turn them onto their back. We would aim to lie the casualty on their back as close to the sump as possible. We would dress them in a side mount harness with appropriately sized tanks strapped to their side. Again, whatever injuries they may have need to be taken care of. If your casualty is uninjured, for instance, if they've been flooded into a cave in some way, this can be modified, and ideally you can give the casualty some kind of lessons or certainly familiarisation with what's going to happen. On the worst case where they're injured, they're going to be laying down, they're going to be on their back. We have the side mount tanks connected to the harness. It may be that you don't want to give the casualty fins. Again, you don't really want them doing too much propulsion. You want them streamlined. You're going to be providing the propulsion. They're going to be quite literally a passenger. The switch block that we use sits on the back of the casualty, and it sits on the back of the casualty when they're underwater in a face down position. The way we manage this is that we connect the switch block by 2 bungees to the side of the casualty, and when the casualty is brought into the water and is rolled face down, they're rolled away from the switch block, and then it begins to sit on their back, and it can be attached to the other side of the casualty by 2 more bungees. The key danger underwater, and I'm stating the obvious here, is that the casualty has nothing to breathe. If the casualty has nothing to breathe, then clearly they're not going to last very long underwater, and they're going to dry drown very quickly. Our switch block has a built-in alarm system. It simply monitors the interstage pressure that is attached to the mask. If that interstage pressure drops below a certain value, then the casualty won't be able to draw breath, and there's an audible and a visual alarm that there's a problem. That problem could be the casualty running out of gas, but it could also be that the switch block has been moved to a position that perhaps it shouldn't have been, or that something has been disconnected. The connectors that we use are locking. The switch block that we use is very positive, but there's still that possibility that through human error, the casualty could have nothing to breathe, and that audible alarm just provides a backup to the rescue diver to say there's something really wrong here, because if the casualty is sedated, they won't be able to tell you that they can't breathe. If the casualty is conscious, they will tell you very quickly. Another advantage of the Kirby Morgan super mask in that situation is that as a last ditch the pod can be removed and a standard open circuit regulator can be placed into the mouth of the casualty. Again, if they're conscious, hopefully they can help you do that. You can purge the regulator and put it straight in their mouth. If they're unconscious, it's going to be significantly more difficult.
There are many roles for cave divers within the cave diving rescue, such as moving equipment or casualty care. But with our one-on-one approach for moving the casualty underwater, the selection of that rescue diver is critical.
Unless the dive is simple and straightforward, diving someone out through a flooded section of cave should be a last resort. I would always prefer to be managing a casualty in an airspace and a dry passage because you have so many more options. As soon as you move underwater, the options reduce significantly and the risk increases massively.
They say, oh my God, I see the way you shine. Take your hand, my dear, and place them both in